Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Amari Turner. I'm a junior here at Tufts, majoring in interdisciplinary studies. I'm also a Tisch scholar, a part of our school's mock trial team, and I was trying to figure out what fun fact of myself I want to share, so I'm going to share two. I'm a failed unicyclist in that I bought a unicycle at the beginning of the pandemic and just never learned how to ride it. And I'm also an advocate of dogs over cats. Yeah. So I'd like to begin by welcoming you all to the Tisch College Solomont Speaker Series event tonight, featuring a conversation with Dahlia Lithwick, author of Lady Justice, Women of the Law, and the Battle to Save America. It's an honor to welcome Dahlia to campus this evening. I'd like to start by saying it's such a pleasure to have you with us tonight. I'm such a fan of your book, and I can't recommend it enough to the folks in the audience who haven't read it yet. Dahlia will actually be signing copies of her book for folks outside the auditorium after the event, so I encourage everyone to get their copies signed. Our friends from the Tufts bookstore will be selling copies as well, and we will have a few free copies of the book for Tufts students in the audience who are interested in reading it. Before we begin, I'd like to take some time to thank our co-sponsors, the Office of Board of Advisors, the Political Science Department, the Tufts Democrats, and the Women's Center and Jumbos for Nonprofits. Their collaboration, along with the support and leadership of Susan and Alan Solomont, is what makes events and discussion like this one possible. This spring, Tisch College is centering its speakers and events around citizen activism and continues to welcome leaders to campus who are advocates for change within their fields and communities. This theme will continue next month with a civic life lunch on arts and activism, and empowering the next generation to build empathy, create change, and end violence against women and girls through art and expression. The event will feature the 15th Edward R. Murrow Forum on Issues in Journalism with journalist and CNN news anchor Abby Phillip, and a conversation with renowned activist, moral leader, and organizer Bishop William J.R. II. You can visit the Tisch College website for the full event schedule and to sign up for future opportunities. The college often adds events and speakers throughout the semester, so feel free to follow @Tisch College on social media for the most up-to-date news, including an exciting speaker announcement coming later this week. Even I don't know who it is, so. Now, for this evening's guest, Dahlia Lithwick. So Dahlia earned her bachelor's in English from Yale and JD from Stanford University. I asked her to share a fun fact with me, and I believe it has something to do with a piece that she wrote about chaos Muppets and order Muppets, but honestly, after she said chaos Muppets and order Muppets, my head went a little awry because I was trying to figure out what that meant, especially to do with the Supreme Court. So now with this, sorry. Now with this semester's theme being citizen activism, we thought no one fit the mold better than Dahlia. Her new book, Lady Justice, uplifts stories of citizen activists, specifically the women lawyers nationwide who challenged many Trump's administration's policy through the courts and won. The book spotlights the stories of women ranging from Sally Yates, the former Attorney General of the United States, who had refused to sign off on the Muslim travel ban, to Becca Heller, the founder of the International Refugee Assistance Project, who brought the fight over the travel ban to the airports, and Stacey Abrams, who worked tirelessly to protect the voting rights of millions of Georgians, and many, many more. Dahlia's powerful ability to weave together inspirational stories in order to issue a call to action for all those who feel the urgency to join these important fights extends well beyond the stories in her latest book. As a senior editor of Slate, she has been writing their Supreme Court dispatches and jurisprudence column since 1999. Dahlia also hosts Amicus, an award-winning bi-weekly podcast that focuses on law and the Supreme Court. If you haven't listened, I'd recommend the recent Lessons from the Trump Years of SCOTUS episode. It broke down many things that I didn't know, and now I'm afraid. So as, as one of the nation's foremost legal commentators, Dahlia's work appeared in the New York Times, Harper's, The New Yorker, the Washington Post, and more. She's also appeared on CNN, ABC, The Colbert Report, The Daily Show, and she's a frequent guest of The Rachel Maddow Show. Joining Dahlia in conversation tonight is Dr. Nancy Thomas, who holds a law degree from the Case Western Reserve University School of Law. and a doctorate from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Nancy is the founding director of Tisch College Institute for Democracy and Higher Education, or IDHE. IDHE is a leading venue for nonpartisan applied research, resources, and advocacy on college student political learning and engagement in democracy. One of its signature initiatives, the National Student Study of Learning, Voting, and Engagement, the NSOLV, is a study of student voting and civic participation of more than 1,100 US colleges and universities of 1 million students. I worked with an organization over the summer that used the NSOLV report, and it was like amazing to me that Tufts produces this, and organizations are really utilizing it to track student voter participation. So I'd like to thank both Nancy and Dahlia for joining us tonight. Please join me in welcoming Dahlia Lithwick and Nancy Thomas for what I'm sure will be a lovely conversation.
Terrific. That was a wonderful introduction. Thank you so much. Welcome, everybody. I'm so glad you're here. This is going to be a lot of fun and a little frightening, I will say. I read the book, and I will recommend it to everybody, but not at bedtime. Thank you so much for coming. It's really an honor. And I've got a question. It's kind of one that I think you get asked a lot, but I think it might help everybody understand what you're thinking. And that is, you've been doing this 25 years. You probably have 100 books in you. Why did you write this one? When you wrote it? And why did you pick this topic?
So first of all, thank you so much for hosting me. It is just such a treat to be here, and it's a treat. Amari, I loved your introduction, and I'm going to send you Order Muppets and Chaos Muppets, because it's like revelatory when you realize we're all one or the other. And no, it has absolutely nothing to do with Supreme Court. There's no one I would rather be in conversation with. I'm just so admiring of the work you have done. I think that the short answer is I had been waiting for a long, long time to write a book. I didn't feel like I wanted to write sort of the book about the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court, as you know, changes every 5 minutes. And whatever book I would have written in 2018, when I sold this book, would be completely obviated by historical events. And I think I also have become increasingly worried as I wrote this book, part of which I wrote while Justice Ginsburg was alive, part of it I wrote after her death, was the ways in which we in this country, but women particularly, were sometimes conflating being in love with RBG with doing social justice work. And for good and for bad, there was just a huge sense in the world that, you know, if we retweeted her like best burns from Shelby County descent, or if we, you know, made sure to say like, you know, here's her like great skim milk joke, you know, Bergefell, we were doing the work of social justice, when in fact we were just like buying a lot of, you know, tote bags. And so I think my sense, kind of careening into the Donald Trump years and then emphatically after, was that like loving RBG was not in fact full-time justice work. And so I wanted to slightly write a book that would counter-program this feeling I was getting, which is we're just going to let her hold up the sky and, you know, watch, and that is us participating in democracy. And after she died, the corollary, which is now we're just going to blame her for absolutely everything that goes wrong, if we just say everything that bad that happens in America from her death onward is her fault, it means we don't have to do anything ourselves. And so I really wanted to counter-program both those stories, because I think they're the same story, mirror imaged. And I wanted to think about the ways we talk about not just the Supreme Court, but the courts generally, as not a story about some great man, let's call him, you know, Hamilton, or let's call him Michael Avenatti for a minute, or let's call him Bob Mueller, or now let's call him Jack Smith, some guy who's just going to save us. And the thing that I was noting, and I guess I should say I covered most of the stories in this book as a journalist in real time, was that despite the desire to say that Justice Ginsburg, who was amazing in every way, but despite the fact of her existence and death, there were in fact and always will be Ruth Baby Ginsburgs all around, doing exactly what she did at the ACLU Women's Rights Project, and they don't get the attention they need, and they are in fact holding up the sky every day. And so the animating, I think, theory for me of the book was, what if everybody could look around and say, like, oh, wait, I could be a Ruth Baby Ginsburg, and in fact I am one, then I would have slightly, I think, punctured the idea that democracy is something that we do as spectators.
I'm glad you did, because I think it's a really compelling book with lots of great stories. I do want to ask you about one that you had me on page 3, all right? And that is when you started to write about Pauli Murray, who is a longtime hero of mine and who was an inspiration to women lawyers, to the queer community, to the Black community, and to Thurgood Marshall and the entire civil rights movement. And yet, I bet a lot of people who haven't read your book yet, and she is profiled, page 3, is they haven't heard of her. And I'm wondering why, maybe you could say a little more about who she is and why you started with her, but then also tell us, why don't we know about her?
Right. So Henry and I just did an interview for the paper about this, and the answer is, I don't know. In my view, every university in the country should have a Pauli Murray library and a Pauli Murray literature department, because Pauli Murray was a poet, and a Pauli Murray school of law, and also a Pauli Murray theology school, because Pauli Murray ends up actually becoming the first woman ordained minister in her church. And I also want to be really precise about language, because there's a real question as to whether, if Pauli Murray were alive today, they would want to be referred to as they. There was no language in Pauli Murray's lifetime, to be super clear, but Pauli Murray certainly was gender nonconforming and may have been wanted to be referred to as they today. I learned of Pauli Murray, and you all should too, from the amazing documentary, My Name is Pauli Murray, that came out in the midst of COVID, from Betsy West and Julie Cohen, who had done the RBG film. And in their interviews with Justice Ginsburg kept mentioning Pauli Murray, and I think at some point they looked at each other and they said, who? And so they did a film that is quite extraordinary, and I was mortified that I had graduated from law school and didn't know this unexcavated history, which they surface, and then I went and read Song in a Weary Throat and other things that Murray had done, and Murray in every single way defies every category that existed for a woman, for a lawyer, for a theological seeker, and part of that is, I think, the reason that history can't pin her down. And just the very, very short version of An Extraordinary Life is that years before Rosa Parks refuses to move to the back of the bus, Pauli Murray refuses to do the same in Virginia. Years before other people are desegregating lunch counters, Pauli Murray is desegregating lunch counters in DC. Pauli Murray, you referred to this, who is the descendant of slaves on the one hand and the descendant of slave owners on the other, cannot get into UNC because Black, cannot get into Harvard Law School because presents as a woman. Pauli Murray at Howard Law School writes a paper saying, just spitballing here, but what if we were to use the 14th Amendment to desegregate schools? literally is laughed at for this paper. It gets binned somewhere in somebody's files. And then, by the way, Thurgood Marshall and the Legal Defense Fund pull it out and use it as what becomes the spine of Brown v. Board of Education. You know whose name is not on that? Pauli Murray. Pauli Murray finds out years later, oh, by the way, they used your law school paper. Justice Ginsburg dusts off Pauli Murray's work again years earlier, using the 14th Amendment similarly to confront gender discrimination, at least puts Murray's name on the brief. But Pauli Murray is 10 steps ahead of every single social justice movement, and therefore doesn't get, I think, kind of placed in the canon as somebody who was doing all the work. And by the end of her life, really does, I think, and Pauli Murray's poetry, by the way, is breathtaking. And by the end of her life, Pauli Murray actually leaves the law altogether in order to join the church. So my kind of long, short answer to your excellent question is because I think nothing can contain Pauli Murray, nothing contains Pauli Murray. And we're only now kind of clawing our way back to understanding that Pauli Murray is the mind behind so much of the 14th Amendment law that we just take for granted today. And I think that I wanted to use that as a launch pad for my sort of Ruth Baby Ginsburg theory of who gets famous and who gets credit, but also as a launch pad for the idea that I think that this story of like some great man who fixes the law is so confounded by the stories of the actual people who toil in obscurity for decades, and we don't know about them because we keep telling that first story, which is wrong.
And I think you said earlier when we were talking with some students that you were even pressured a little bit by editors to write a book about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and that you pushed back and said, no, I'm going to write about these unsung heroes.
Yeah, I think, there was always a publisher who was just like, but there's this book about RBG that should be written. And my feeling was, and there are so many phenomenal books, and there will be more books, and my feeling was what I needed to write, particularly in the moment that the Trump administration felt as though it had this overwhelming sort of imprimatur over what we thought was justice and what we thought was equality and dignity, was that I needed to write the story of all the people that we didn't know about who were fighting that, because I think that's where power came from.
Well, speaking of people we haven't heard of, and I'm not going to go through every chapter and every woman in the book because there are so many good ones, but I did want to touch on Becca Heller. And I was curious about why you picked her. Obviously, she did a lot of amazing work on the Muslim ban, but what was so telling is she was a student at the time. She was a law student. And I wondered if you could share what her story is, what she did, and also some lessons that might be valuable to the students in the audience.
So Becca's a very fun chapter if you're me, because Becca really confounds any kind of Frank Capra story about the noble attorney, right? Becca describes standing outside of JFK Airport the day that the travel ban comes down, and she's like in ripped jeans and a hoodie, and her mom's like, what are you wearing on national television right now? But like, that's Becca Heller in a nutshell. She actually had graduated at that point. She was at Yale Law School. She was very much one of those people who wasn't sure why she was going to law school, gets there, is just like, what am I doing here? Founds this group called IRAP, which becomes a refugee project, and essentially Becca is a fun character because it's very clear she has no magical thinking about the law as conferring dignity and equality upon us. She's just like, I guess I'm here. Someone better do some stuff for refugees. I guess that's me. And yes, she was, in fact, illegally practicing law at Yale Law School before she got her JD, which she totally cops to in the book. She's like, oh yeah, I was doing that. So she's a very fun character to write about because she's just such a total iconoclast. I think one of the reasons I wanted to write about her, and her chapter is in some ways paired with Sally Yates, who was the acting attorney general at the time, and all this happens within a few days of each other. But Sally Yates is sort of majesty of the law and really does talk like a Frank Capra character, and you're just like, but come on, underneath it all, and she's like, underneath it all, there's more majesty of the law. And Becca's just not that person. And so it's fun that they're both kind of different versions of this same early iteration of resistance. Maybe the last thing that I would say that made that chapter so powerful to me as a kind of engine for what I wanted the book to be is that the simplicity of what Becca Heller was organizing, which I describe in the book as the airport revolution, but you may recall, within hours of President Trump signing the executive order that was banning not just immigration, not just refugees, but also people who had valid academic visas to teach and to learn, people who were joining families, who had a credible fear of being persecuted in Afghanistan and in Iraq. All those people midair suddenly have no status. And they find out midair, they land at JFK, they land at Dulles, at Dallas-Fort Worth in San Francisco, and suddenly they're being told, oh, we're taking your visa and also you have nowhere to go. And what I loved about Becca's chapter is that you may recall across the country, lawyers just showed up, right? And to me, the most moving moment of the sort of first days of the executive order was just watching these armies of people who are like, I'm just a tax attorney, I just do divorce law, but I guess now I'm an immigration lawyer because Becca Heller told me to show up at the airport. And they were all holding up signs, right, standing in baggage claims, saying more or less, I don't know anything, but if you need a lawyer, I'm here to help you. And it's the most moving kind of avatar to me of what lawyers can do and can be in the world. And this is the last thing I'll say, but there was this amazing moment when outside SFO in San Francisco, the crowds were chanting, let the lawyers in, let the lawyers in. And I was like, oh my God, my whole life, like I've been the butt of a lawyer joke. And for like 1 nanosecond, we're the heroes of the story. And I think Becca makes that possible. She's the one who gets that whole thing started. And maybe just slightly, to make you sad as promised, it felt as though this was a thing that could have been sustained in 1,000 contexts. Lawyers holding up signs saying, all I do is like trusts and estates, but I will help you navigate this. And in a sense, it's a little bit of a lost promise.
I can see that. So I went to law school and then I went to the ed school, and I'm going to push you on something in your book. Your book is pink. It's called Lady Justice. Starting in the 1970s, Carol Gilligan started examining how decisions are made and the dominance of moral reasoning that was framed by men. And that catalyzed a lot of research about how women lead, how women learn, how women communicate, how women know, lots of ways of women knowing. And I'm going to ask you, are you saying that women have a unique moral compass to recreate democracy as more just?
Absolutely not.
Are you sure?
And I came up reading Carol Gilligan. It informed, I took that class. It informed the way I thought about moral reasoning and gender. And I came to the coverage of the Supreme Court at exactly the moment that Justices O'Connor and Ginsburg were both on the court. And there was a long stretch in there, and you probably know this literature better than I do, where a lot of legal academics were writing articles mapping Carol Gilligan onto Sandra Day O'Connor and saying, like, here is, absolutely this is playing out, where Sandra Day O'Connor tended to be relational, right? She tended to kind of be problem solving. There were not hard and fast rules, there were standards. All of that felt like it mapped onto Justice O'Connor. And then the minute Justice Ginsburg comes on the court, like that all detonates, all that scholarship, lighted on fire, because they couldn't be more different. Here's Justice Ginsburg comes onto the court and she does rules instead of standards, right? She doesn't do relational, she doesn't do problems. All of Carol Gilligan is confounded. And so I came to the court sort of as a natural experiment in challenging Carol Gilligan. But what I found was, and I think I said this in the book, over the course of their careers, Ginsburg and O'Connor, as it turned out, only agreed about 50% of the time, right? They were very much a Republican and a Democrat who saw the world totally differently. On cases that were inflected with gender issues, they agreed 90% of the time. So what does that mean? It means not that there's some singular unitary form of moral reasoning, but that women from totally different perspectives who look at the world in ways that are not in any way analogous, when it comes to gender, somehow conformed with each other. And to me, that was interesting, because what it meant was that their experience of their own lives, whether it's pay discrimination or whether it's pregnancy discrimination, all the ways in which they didn't agree on anything, but they knew this had happened, and they knew how they thought about it, and it aligned. And to me, that was kind of the thing that I wanted to live in that tension of what if we could stipulate there's no such thing as gendered moral reasoning. I think we don't think that anymore. But what if we could also say that women approaching gender issues from very different moral places could come to the same outcomes?
Really good. All right, so then I'm going to ask you to fast forward a bit. And you were sitting through the Brett Kavanaugh hearings. Tell us, first of all, what was that like?
So it was interesting. A couple of things that I will say that are interesting. One is, for reasons too complicated to unpack, most media outlets send their political reporters to confirmation hearings. They don't send their Supreme Court reporters. I think because we're seen as kind of like academic and wonky, and this is ultimately a really political event, so they have us on speed dial. They'll call us, right, the political reporters, and they'll be like, what's Griswold versus Connecticut, quick. They don't actually necessarily, but they don't want us in the room and we don't want to be in the room because we don't want to think about the court as a political institution. We want to think about it as a magical holy temple in the sky. And so this is very unseemly for us to cover them. So I'm saying this snarkily, but it's in fact true. It is a partisan political enterprise that is covered as a political sporting event. So the fact that I was in the room was very strange. Most places sent political reporters. The room was very small. I was quite far back. I was there all morning as Dr. Ford testified. The two things I would say are, it was fascinating when we broke, after she finished testifying, every single person, every reporter said, this is over. She's done. And in fact, Chuck Grassley, we had heard on Fox News, it's over, this is done. She is completely unimpeachable as a witness. This is an incredibly credible story and very damning. It's done. And then Judge Kavanaugh came in, and as you recall, was banging on the table and shouting and getting angrier and angrier, insulting some of the women on the committee. And it was very palpable to me that a lot of the women reporters in the room, their shoulders were going up, this was being experienced quite viscerally. The other thing that was just interesting is my then, 14-year-old son, who was watching at school in Manhattan, texted me about, half an hour into Judge Kavanaugh's testimony and said, are you perfectly safe in there? Literally felt that this man is screaming and possibly out of control and that his mom isn't safe. Now, at one level, and I think I say this in the book, of course I was safe. This was a piece of, public performance art. It had nothing to do with justice or, truth-seeking. It was just a thing that was happening. At another level, I think I say, none of us were actually super safe after that moment. And I think that that's how people experienced it not in the room, but the extent to which that original thought, which was, this is over, immediately flipped into, oh, he's going to get confirmed. And the sort of breakneck pace at which we experienced that in the span of just a few minutes is a feeling that I think was a kind of emblematic of what was coming for the rest of the country.
So I think I read somewhere that a year later, were you going to the Supreme Court physically? I mean, what was happening?
I just pretended I had a cold for an extremely long time. And at that point, I had been going, and covering oral argument at the court for years. I was very discomfited. I'm trying to think of the way to say this. I felt that the speed with which we went from, there are a whole bunch of witnesses, there are questions, there are people who want to talk to the FBI, this is meant to be a truth-seeking inquiry, we're going to find stuff out, to, and we're done, and he's being sworn in, again, happened, head-snappingly quickly, and I wasn't caught up to the, and now we're just going to go into oral arguments and say, Justice Kavanaugh, looking resplendent in black, asked a probing three-part question. Like, I wasn't there. I was still back in the room. And so I kept quite literally saying, I don't think I can go in today again. And my editor at some point cottoned on to the fact that I was just not going into the building. And after a year, when it was evident that I could not bring myself to go into the building and kind of normalize it and put the, for me, the imprimatur of normalizing it on something that I felt we had disserved Dr. Ford. I felt that we had not taken her seriously or respected her. I felt as though she opened a vein in that room and we sort of stepped over her and moved on. And so I just couldn't get myself there. And so I wrote a piece about a year later. Once I said to my editor, I just don't think I can sit in there and cover the court as though it's the same court. And by the way, I came on covering the court after the Thomas Hill hearings. So I wasn't in the room for that. This would have possibly been my response to those hearings as well. But this was, for me, a moment of, for me to go in there and just act like he's one of 9 justices, feels like it is selling short what she attempted to do. And it is putting a sort of thumb on the scale of this was a normal process. And so I wrote a piece at the urging of my editor essentially explaining, like, look, I'll keep covering the court, but I can't go in there and pretend this is what it was a year ago because it's not, and also I don't have a cold.
So would you say you cover constitutional law or the law, or would you say you cover justice?
How much time do we have? I mean, one of the things I think we have all learned, if we didn't know it before, is that the law and justice are very different things and always have been. And that the Constitution and justice and the law are also very different things and always have been. I think probably now I live on the seam between what the law is and what I imagine it could be, because we've seen how confounded that has been in the last few years. And I think, and this is a sort of a larger question, but I've been very aware, and you can hear this in the podcast this year, of all the ways in which we cover the Supreme Court on the Supreme Court's own terms, right? So we're like, okay, I guess they only hear 60 cases a year now. Cool. We don't know why. I guess we're hearing affirmative action again, even though we just heard a case about this. Okay, guess we're hearing abortion again, even though this was resolved definitively twice in the last 4 years. Okay, and that we in the press corps take all of that framing, these are the cases we're hearing this year, as though that is justice. And so one of the things I've been thinking about a lot on the podcast is, what would it be to cover the Supreme Court beyond the, I don't want to say 60 merits cases because we only actually cover, about 12 of them as though they're important, But instead of covering those like it's a sporting event, on the one hand, affirmative action, on the other hand, can they pick off 5 votes? I don't know. But like this isn't, ESPN. Like this is real. People's lives are affected. And so I've been kind of trying to figure out how to reimagine court coverage, partly from outside the building, because I don't go in anymore, but partly also not in collusion with this myth that these are just the 15 cases that somehow inexorably we're looking at this year, because that's the court setting the agenda. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. It also makes me think about how our lens shapes what we see. And, you and I are both white women, and yet it's not lost on me that these injustices are disproportionately affecting communities other than white women. And I wondered how you treat that in your journalism and your coverage of the Supreme Court.
I think, one of the lessons that I took from even justices that I was always a little bit frustrated with coming up. So I'm thinking of Justice Kennedy, Justice O'Connor, who could be so myopic about their own experience in the world. I mean, they really were. They tended to be like, well, this never happened to me, so I guess it doesn't happen. And you're just like, no, get out of your head. And I think one of the things that they would talk about frequently, and they both talked about it frequently, was what it was like to sit in conference with Thurgood Marshall and find out, as they would put it, that you don't know what you don't know. And they would always say, even if I didn't agree with Justice Marshall, if you sat in conference with him, and he was this famous raconteur, I mean, he would tell these long stories about his own, appellate practice and trial practice, and like literally what it was like to be chased out of the courthouse out the back door and chased by police for trying to do what he was doing at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And what they would say is like, I was always learning what I didn't know. And I feel like that is gone at the court right now. There's almost the opposite of interest in finding out what you don't know. And it's more so than the personnel change at the court. It's the humility of, being curious about other experiences that feels like it has fallen away. And so for me, a good example of this is, as I was covering last year reproductive freedom and first SB 8 in Texas, that was the quote unquote vigilante bill that gave, a bounty to anybody who turned in somebody aiding and abetting an abortion. But then Dobbs, what I was very mindful of was the scholarship of people like Michelle Goodwin, the scholarship of people like Dorothy Roberts, the scholarship of people like Peggy Cooper Davis. These are people who've been writing for 20 years. This is what's coming. And if you don't think that Black women's bodies are the canaries in the coal mine, if this is happening to you for the first time, then you don't know what you don't know. And I was really, really struck, particularly in this context, by how much people were sort of like arrested by the fact that for the first time in America, you can't get an abortion. And that was just not true. The day the Hyde Amendment was signed, for many, many people of color in many, many states, that was the end. And so I think a little bit of what, and it's a little bit of the answer to the Polly Murray question, is for me, so much of the book had to be, how did I go through law school and not know how much I don't know? And who can I find to tell me what I don't know? And maybe just the coda to that is, for me, one of the most shocking podcasts we did this year was Brackeen, which is this case about the Indian Child Welfare Act that is being challenged and will probably, I think, is in trouble. Maggie Blackhawk, who was the Indian law attorney who came on the show, said to me in the last 3 minutes of a very painful podcast about a very painful case, said, Dahlia, you keep talking about Native American rights as though Native Americans have rights. They don't actually have rights under the Constitution. This is a colonial power, and this is a system in which, in exchange for the promise of being taken care of, They were given certain things that are not, in fact, rights at all. And she said the framing of ICWA, of the Indian Child Welfare Act, was that this was imperiling Native American rights and tribal sovereignty and rights. She was like, neither tribal sovereignty nor rights are constitutional constructs. And I just remember being, you can hear it in the podcast, being absolutely rocked back on my heels that this frame that I had been using for 20 years was fundamentally false. And so I think part of my answer to your question is, the more I do this, the more I realize I have no idea what I'm talking about most of the time.
Okay. So we have, I'm just going to open it up to the group, but I'll ask one more question while you collect your questions. If you have them, come up to the mic. And so I've got this here. And what I really want to do is pull a word from each. So I'm going to do that, actually. And my words are lawyering, activism, organizing, Stacey Abrams, and voting.
Those are good words.
Those are good words, because I came away from your book thinking, I don't have to be a lawyer to do this. I don't have to have a law degree. I don't even have to know the law, because the law is not serving very many of us very well. And maybe I should be looking to heroes like Stacey Abrams, who's sat up here and done the speaker series as well. And so I wondered, what are the lessons of the book that are a little outside the parameters of the law, but get at people like Stacey Abrams?
Yeah, I mean, I think halfway through the book, it became very clear to me, we put this in the bucket of I don't know what I'm talking about, that if I was just going to write a book about a series of sequential lawsuits, I was going to miss the story. And that nobody loves telling, that like, dun, 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 objection. Like, nobody loves telling that story more than I do. Lawsuits are, built for drama. They're amazing. And they're also not the solution, right? And as I have said before, you can win all the lawsuits in the world and lose democracy. And that we're in that moment now. There's a whole chapter about Bridget Amiri winning this massive victory for reproductive rights for a Texas asylum seeker at the border, and wins the case, and we ride off into the sunset, and now nobody in Texas has the rights that Bridget won only a few short years ago. And so for me, the kind of pivot in the book is Vanita Gupta, who had been lawyering her whole life, who suddenly finds herself at the Justice Department, not lawyering, but doing consent decrees and police oversight and police reform. And because it's organizing, right? Then she leaves the Justice Department, and all she's doing at this point at the leadership conference is organizing. And that vaults us into Stacey Abrams. It vaults us into all the chapters that are about voting and voting rights and democracy repair. And so the slightly snarky answer is, you remember when there was the cookbook about, you bake the broccoli into the brownies and your kids don't know they're eating greens? There's a little bit of, how do I possibly explain redistricting, which it's really hard. How do I explain what happened in Shelby County and Brnovich and Citizens United to constrict the vote? I have to do it through these women, but it's not lawsuits now. It's organizing and democracy work. And maybe the end of the answer is, it is so clear to me that the reason women's reproductive freedom was vindicated in Michigan and Kansas and Kentucky and all the states that put it on the ballot in the midterms, and Kansas right before, has nothing to do with lawyers. It has to do with people, feet on the ground, bodies on the street, saying this isn't something that we can wait to see happen in a courtroom. Because, by the way, here's the bad news, we're going to lose in courts a lot.
Yeah. All right. Wow. We are going to lose in courts a lot, and we're seeing that happen over and over. And so I think you're right. We have to do an end run around it and mobilize. Would anybody like to ask some questions? There are a lot of topics on the table, actually. There's some great great lawyers. There's some really unjust laws. There's the possibility of another book for another Trump era.
Are you going to ask me to just do impressions of the justices?
Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Supriya, and I'm a huge fan. I listen to Amicus all the time. Your voice sounds exactly the same as it does in the podcast, which is like wild. So I am not a lawyer, not planning on being one. I almost did because of listening to Amicus. But what I wanted to ask is, you're an amazing writer and speaker and thinker. Something that I feel like I've learned so much from listening to your podcast is just like how you formulate an argument and a framework. And I'm thinking of getting into writing about tech policy. I'm in tech, and that's something I'm interested in. And I have no idea like where to start on how to, just becoming a better writer and starting a blog or something, whatever it is. I just wanted to kind of like get your advice on how would you recommend starting an endeavor like that?
Great question.
Sorry, not super related to justice.
No,
but,
it's a great question. I mean, I think that, it's clear that I have a two-part answer to everything. And people who listen to the podcast know I ask like three-part questions, and then whoever the poor person is like, Dahlia, I don't even remember it's a huge flaw. I mean, two things. One is, in some sense, you're doing exactly the right thing, which is get really good at a thing. I am often asked, does it make a difference having a JD going into covering the law? At one level, the bulk of the Supreme Court press corps don't have JDs. At another level, I think it gives you this sort of patina of, no, I really know my stuff, to really know your stuff. And I think much more important than journalism school or, other sort of formal training to be a writer and thinker or public intellectual, I think knowing something really, really well is the way to go. The second part of the answer is you just start doing it. You just do it. And here is where I will say, to this day, if I call women law professors and say, I need you to knock out 1,200 words on whatever the thing is that happened, they'll be like, I don't know if I know it well enough. Can I have 2 weeks? I want to workshop it with some other. I mean, these are people who, are endowed chairs. And they're like, could I co-write it with some people? No, because you know what? I'm going to call, the next call is going to be to some guy who's like, I don't know anything about it, and you'll have 1,200 words on your desk in the morning. And I think, I just think, it's that crazy answer. I mean, this is the other thing that I tell frequently law students, but I'll tell you. Every meeting at a law firm will involve partners saying, okay, we've got this great case, right? It's on maritime law. Who wants it? And unfailingly, there is some woman sitting around the table who has like an MPhil from Oxford on maritime law. Who's like, I don't know, maybe no. And there's a guy eating a tuna sandwich. And he's like, I'm eating a tuna sandwich, and thus I'm an expert on maritime law. I will take the case. This is the thing that we do. And I'm wildly overgeneralizing, for which I'm sorry. I wrote a pink book, so you live with it. But I think it's that thing. We just have to step into the space. And the number of conversations I have with people who are like, well, I don't know, how do I? You just do it. And once you've written 3 times, you are the world expert on tech law. That's the good news. You just have to do it. And I think, and I'm not saying this in any way to belittle, because I know the tendency, but I said earlier when I met with students that it is so striking to me that almost every woman I interviewed for the book had this moment where she was like, I can't do this. I don't know this. There's 100 groups with multiple letters in their titles that should be doing this work, and they're not doing it. And I'm sitting here, and I'm Becca Heller, and I'm wearing ripped jeans and a hoodie. And every one of them massively doubted whether she belonged in that space. And part of the reason I needed to write the book is they all belonged in that space. And at a moment when a lot of other people failed to step in, it was the people who wanted to know, like, can I just get like 4 years of coaching before I have to like bring a lawsuit? And it was like, here we go. And so it isn't to say be as arrogant as tuna sandwich guy. I am not advocating for being that guy, but I am saying you know more than most people already who are doing this. And so then the thing is to just kind of brazen through like the early parts of it, which are hard and scary for sure. And this is like, we could have a whole other conversation about making money doing journalism, which is like not a great moment right now. But I think that the answer is like we just have to feel entitled to just step in and start doing it. Okay.
A great answer. Great answer. Anybody else? Done a lot of facilitation, I'll warn you. I'm very comfortable with silence. I think it gives you a chance to think about your thoughts, so.
Go ahead. You want me to go first, and then you can slow walk around? I'll be quick. Hi. Dahlia, thank you so much for coming to Tufts. My name is Dana Fleming. I am an attorney, and I'm an attorney here for the university. And I encouraged and dragged a whole bunch of people with me, including our female general counsel, Mary Jacob, who's there, and lots of other wonderful female lawyers who work here. I've been following you since the 90s. I just want to thank you for writing a pink book about the law. And I wanted to just highlight something that comes up at the very beginning of your book, where you said you were speaking with a law professor about writing this book, and he said, why would you want to write a pink book about the law? So for our students, and even for me, how do you get to be Dahlia Lithwick, the Dahlia Lithwick, and have somebody say that to you? What are the rest of us supposed to do in those moments?
I mean, I think you just write a little pink book about the law. I think the answer is you do it. And when your publisher gets a little hinky about it being quite that pink, you say, I really need this to be pink at this point. I mean, I think, you know, the point of the story isn't to make us all feel disempowered. I think it is just to recognize, and we were talking about this with the students too, that, you know, the podcast I did the day SB 8 was signed was me and Rebecca Traister and Michelle Goodwin, and we were upset and we were worried, and we said this is the end of Dobbs. If the Supreme Court blesses SB 8, there's no Roe v. Wade. We don't need to hear, you know, this case out of Mississippi. And all of the reader mail was, you're a bunch of hysterical women, you're overreacting, you know, I come to this show to hear serious, sober legal reflection, and you guys were all just like, wah, wah, wah. And I was just like, I'm just gonna sit here. And then, you know, when Dobbs came down, I wanted the only thing I wrote that day to be, I told you so, like, warned you. And this is just, you know, you can talk to any number of women who are, you know, do this work, many of them much more prominent than me, and this is just a moment in which women are often told that they are overreacting, they are, you know, narrow casting, they are parochial. You know, my joke at the time, which I didn't say to the professor, who I will not name, I know you want me to, but my joke at the time was that if Jeff Toobin had written a book about, you know, the women lawyers in the Trump era, it would not have been seen as narrow casting. And so I think my slight answer is a little bit the answer that I gave before, which is you just do it. You just keep doing it. And you recognize that, like, if there is any kind of justice in the world, the person who comes behind you that writes a book about women lawyers isn't told that they are, as he said, squandering your capital as a serious reporter. They are told, like, cool, this is a thing that we do now. And so does it totally suck to be talked to this way? Well, yes, it does. But is it a part of, I think, the sort of like inevitable essential work so that for the students in the room, they don't get asked that question? Yeah.
I'm Erin. I am hoping you can give us some words of inspiration, because I don't think I'm alone that I look at the Supreme Court now and I see far too many people look like the worst man I've ever met. So like really just that angry, entitled, it's just very discouraging. So I know you're Canadian. You have that backup citizenship in your pocket. What keeps you interested in the United States and our Supreme Court and frankly just living here? So if you have any inspirational words, that's what I'm looking for.
Here's what I would say, and I really believe this from the bottom of my heart. If the midterms had not gone the way they did, I would be much sadder right now. To me, every single version of what the midterms taught us is that women and young people and people who care about climate and guns and democracy still really do have their hands on the levers. I think, and I really believe this deeply, that we're in a crisis not of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is a symptom, it is not the problem. The problem is democracy. And that all of the stuff that we thought was just self-executing and self-perpetuating, voting, it works, it was never true, right? And so we are now living in a system that was designed as a minority rule system that gave all the rights and privileges to white landholding men and sort of knock-on rights to some others, apparently not Indian tribes. That is now in full blossom, right? And so we are now seeing a system that, in my view, and this is the good news and the bad news, is working exactly as designed, right? To suppress majority rule. And whether it's the filibuster, whether it's the Electoral College, whether it's a grossly malapportioned Senate, whether it is lifetime tenure on the Supreme Court, justices who are appointed by presidents who lose the popular vote and then blessed by a Senate that doesn't reflect majorities, who then constrict voting rights. Okay, so now that's working exactly as designed. And so I think what gives me hope is those women knocking on doors in Michigan. Because despite every effort to thwart democracy, they broke its back, right? And Michigan, by the way, if you look at what Michigan is doing right this minute, it's proof positive that citizen activism, doing away with gerrymandering, this is all fixable. And so what I'd like to say is, we didn't see the cracks in the system. We thought the system was great. And by me, I do not include Dorothy Roberts, who's been writing for decades, warning that the system was gonna work this way. And for everybody to be on the same page and saying, like, what we now have to do? Fix malapportionment, fix gerrymandering, fix the Electoral Count Act. It is a ton of work, and it is doable work, and good people are doing the work, and a lot of them are women, and so we have to find them. It's like what Mr. Rogers used to say, look for the helpers. They are everywhere, and it's kind of why I wrote this book. If I believed that this was irreparable, like I would be in the Northwest Territories sobbing in an igloo. But I really think that you need to be able to name the problems before you can fix them. And an awful lot of us were too privileged to be able to name the problems, and now we can. And I think everything I am seeing, Supreme Court notwithstanding, suggests that people are not giving up.
Thank you so much.
Well, I think that's a perfect segue to going downstairs, signing your book. Make sure there are books down there. The bookstore will be there. There are extra books. And Dahlia Lithwick, this has been an honor and a privilege, and we are so lucky to have you. So thank you very much for coming to Tufts University.
Thank you for having me.